At the end of the First Age, Middle-earth faced its greatest dragon. Ancalagon the Black, Morgoth's ultimate weapon, blotted out the sun, melted stone with his fire, and shattered mountains with his fall. How did this monstrous force rise, and what led to his final battle with Eärendil? This is the story of Ancalagon the Black, the dragon who nearly destroyed Middle-earth. In the earliest days of Middle-earth, long before recorded history, a dark power named Morgoth waged endless wars against the free peoples of the world. As the first Dark Lord, his armies of orcs, demons, and monsters had brought devastation to the lands of elves and men. His fortress of Angband stood as an impregnable bastion of evil, protected by mountains of iron and gates of unbreakable steel. 3 massive volcanic peaks called Thangorodrim loomed above it, their shadows casting eternal darkness over the lands below. Despite commanding vast forces of darkness, Morgoth found himself repeatedly thwarted by the skill and valor of his enemies. The elves, blessed with immortality and ancient wisdom, proved especially resilient against his armies. Their weapons cut through his strongest armor, and their arrows found marks that should have been impossible to hit. Even his most fearsome creatures fell before their blades. The armies of men, though mortal, fought with a desperate courage that frustrated Morgoth's plans time and again. United with the elves, they formed alliances that pushed back his forces, denying him the swift victory he had expected. This resistance infuriated the Dark Lord, driving him to seek ever more powerful weapons. Deep in Angband's laboratories, protected by layers of stone and sorcery, Morgoth began a series of dark experiments. His goal was singular: to create weapons so powerful that no army could stand against them. The Dark Lord worked tirelessly, combining his knowledge of the world's creation with corrupted magic. The screams that echoed from his workshops caused even his most hardened servants to tremble. His first success came with the creation of dragons. Glaurung, the first of his worms, emerged as a wingless terror whose scales gleamed like iron, whose breath could melt stone, whose size dwarfed anything the elves and men had ever seen. In the year 455 of the First Age, Glaurung led Morgoth's armies through the gates of Angband in an assault that would become known as the Battle of Sudden Flame, transforming the fair plains of Ardgarlan into a scorched wasteland now known as Anfauglith, the gasping dust. Morgoth was pleased, but even Glaurung had limits. Armies now retreat to positions where the terrain itself provided protection. Mountain strongholds and island fortresses remained beyond his reach. Morgoth, studying these limitations, returned to his experiments with renewed purpose. In Angband's deepest pits, the Dark Lord pushed his creations further. He sought to combine the devastating power of dragons with the freedom of flight. The process proved challenging even for one of his might. Many attempts resulted in failure, producing creatures too weak to fly or too unstable to control. Strange sounds began to echo from the fortress depths, the screech of leather against air, the crash of failed attempts, and finally, the thunderous beating of mighty wings. The Dark Lord had succeeded in creating the first winged dragons, but he kept them hidden, perfecting them in secret. None outside Angband's walls knew the true extent of his experiments. After succeeding in creating the first winged dragons, Morgoth transformed the depths of Angband into a massive breeding ground. The fortress's deepest halls, originally carved for armies and treasures, became nesting chambers. Each cavern housed dragons at different stages of development, from newly hatched to nearly mature. The corridors echoed with roars and the beating of wings as his creatures learned to master flight. Among these dragons, one emerged that immediately caught Morgoth's attention. From the moment of his hatching, Ancalagon displayed power beyond any dragon before him. Within days, he had already outgrown dragons 10 times his age. His dark scales seemed to be absorbing all light that touched them. His eyes blazed with an inner fire that made even Morgoth's most hardened commanders step back in fear. Morgoth's servants worked tirelessly to sustain this growing army, with Ancalagon's appetite alone requiring entire herds. Hunting parties ranged further and further from the fortress, stripping the northern lands bare. Villages found their livestock missing, while wild creatures fled south, sensing the growing threat in the north. The Dark Lord would personally oversee Ancalagon's development, recognizing in him the potential for ultimate weapon of war. Where other dragons required constant control and direction, he displayed a natural understanding of power and dominance. His mere presence in the breeding pits caused other dragons to cower and submit. Ancalagon's first flight launched himself from Angband's depths with such force that the entire fortress trembled. His wings, spanning wider than any dragon before or since, created windstorms with each beat. Despite his enormous size, he moved with deadly grace, turning on a wing's edge and striking with pinpoint accuracy. His breath weapon proved equally exceptional. Where other dragons' flames could melt stone, his could vaporize it instantly. During training exercises, his fire burned so hot it left the very air distorted, creating heat mirages that persisted for days. The walls of Angband's deepest chambers, forged from black iron, bore permanent scars from his practice sessions. As his aerial force grew, with Ancalagon at its head, Morgoth imposed strict discipline on their deployment. No dragon was permitted to fly beyond Angband's walls without direct orders. The Dark Lord knew that revealing his weapons too soon would give his enemies time to prepare defenses. Instead, he focused on perfecting their strength and attack patterns. Under Ancalagon's leadership, the dragon host transformed from a collection of powerful individuals into a coordinated army. His roars developed specific patterns that the lesser dragons learned to recognize and obey. He directed them in complex aerial maneuvers, positioning them for maximum tactical advantage. Those who survived his harsh training learned to coordinate their attacks with their leader, forming the nucleus of what would become Morgoth's aerial army. Daily training exercises shook the grounds of Angband. Ancalagon led the dragons in practicing battle formations in darkness, navigating by sound and smell when visibility was poor. They perfected diving attacks against moving targets, honing their accuracy with both claw and flame. While some other dragons struggled to maintain formation around him, because the winds from his wings would throw them off course. Year after year, Morgoth restrained his urge to unleash his weapons. He watched as his enemies grew complacent, as they developed tactics and defenses against his ground forces. All the while, his aerial army grew stronger under Ancalagon's command, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In the depths of Angband, Morgoth watched as Ancalagon grew into something beyond imagining. Each passing day, the black dragon's size surpassed all expectations, until even the Dark Lord himself stood in awe of what he had created. Ancalagon's wings, when fully extended, they could cast shadows over villages. Its scales, black as the void between stars, proved harder than any armor ever forged. His growth required constant feeding. Entire herds of beasts disappeared into Angband's depths. Morgoth's servants scoured the lands for food, their raids reaching further and further as Ancalagon's appetite increased. Those who failed to provide sufficient sustenance often became sustenance themselves. As Ancalagon grew, so did its powers. Its flame burned hotter than any forge, capable of melting stone and vaporizing metal. The very air shimmered in its presence, distorted by the heat that radiated from its massive form. Even other dragons kept their distance, instinctively recognizing a superior predator. Morgoth continued to shape and train his ultimate weapon. He taught Ancalagon the ways of war, instructing it in tactics that would maximize its devastating potential. The dragon learned to use its size not just for destruction, but for psychological warfare, understanding how its very shadow could break enemy morale. The Dark Lord bred more winged dragons during this time, creating a whole host of aerial warriors. Yet none approached Ancalagon's magnitude. These lesser dragons would serve as its honor guard, a swarm of destruction to herald its coming. Morgoth arranged them in hierarchies, with Ancalagon as their unquestioned master. Meanwhile, the war against the Free Peoples continued. Morgoth used his other forces to maintain pressure on his enemies, still keeping his greatest weapon hidden. He had spent centuries scheming how best to wield this new dimension of warfare. Against attackers from above, no fortifications could stand, no wall could rise high enough, no moat deep enough to halt his winged terrors. In time, all of Middle-earth would bow before him, and he, Morgoth, would remake it in his own image. And so he believed. The presence of such massive creatures didn't go unnoticed. Strange signs began appearing in the lands around Angband. Tremors shook the northern plains without explanation. Mysterious roars echoed from the fortress, unlike any sound heard before in Middle-earth. Scouts reported unusual cloud formations and unexplained periods of darkness. Fishermen in the northern waters reported massive shadows passing overhead, though nothing could be seen through the clouds. Mountain patrols found entire herds of animals vanished overnight, with only massive footprints left behind. Birds began avoiding the airspace around Angband, creating an eerie silence in the skies near the fortress. As reports of these disturbances reached the outside world, various explanations emerged. Some believed Morgoth was simply forging new weapons. Others thought he was conducting magical experiments. A few suggested he might be breeding some new kind of war beast. None guessed the true scale of what was growing in Angband's depths. In the year 545 of the First Age, the balance of power shifted dramatically. The Valar, divine beings who had shaped the world itself, finally answered the desperate pleas of elves and men. They gathered a vast host of Maiar, elves and men to march upon Angband. This army of the West represented the greatest military force ever assembled in Middle-earth. The meeting of the hosts of the West and of the North is named the Great Battle and the War of Wrath. There was marshaled the whole power of the throne of Morgoth, and it had become great beyond count, so that Anfauglith could not contain it, and all the North was aflame with war. The War of Wrath began with tremendous force. The host of the West drove back Morgoth's armies with unprecedented success. Balrogs, creatures of shadow and flame, fell before the might of the Valar's champions. Orc legions shattered against elven shields. Trolls crumbled to dust under divine wrath. The tide of battle pushed inexorably toward Angband itself. For over 4 decades, the war raged across the northern lands. Mountains crumbled under the weight of battle. Valleys filled with the dead. Rivers ran red with blood, and entire forests burned. The very shape of the land changed as divine powers clashed. Morgoth's forces, once seemingly endless, began to weaken and scatter before the relentless assault of the West. Deep in Angband, Morgoth watched his empire crumbling. His mighty armies lay broken, his territories seized, his servants fleeing or falling in battle. The Dark Lord, who had once stood proud and terrible before all creation, now quailed in his fortress. He dared not venture forth himself, knowing his defeat was near. But in the deepest pits of Angband, he held one last weapon, one final, terrible gambit. In 587 of the First Age, as his defeat seemed certain, Morgoth made his last desperate move. The winged dragons, his most terrible weapons, burst forth from Angband's depths without warning. They had never been seen before in Middle-earth, and their sudden appearance brought chaos and terror. The very air exploded with thunder, lightning split the sky, and a tempest of fire rained down upon friend and foe alike. Then, seeing that his hosts were overthrown and his power dispersed, Morgoth quailed, and he dared not to come forth himself. But he loosed upon his foes the last desperate assault that he had prepared, and out of the pits of Angband there issued the winged dragons that had not before been seen. And so sudden and ruinous was the onset of that dreadful fleet that the host of the Valar was driven back, for the coming of the dragons was with great thunder and lightning and a tempest of fire. Leading this terrible force, was Ancalagon the Black. His wingspan blocked out the sun like an eclipse, casting a shadow that spread panic through the ranks below. His scales didn't simply reflect darkness. They devoured light itself, creating a dragon-shaped void that moved through the sky. The Maiar, divine beings who served the Valar and witnessed the shaping of the world, stood silent before this monstrosity. The elves, who had endured centuries of war and faced countless horrors, felt their ancient courage waver. Mighty human warriors who had never broken rank now dropped their weapons in terror. The sight of Ancalagon broke something fundamental in their understanding of what was possible. No living being should be so massive, so utterly beyond comprehension. The initial attack devastated the armies of the West. Dragonfire rained from above in never-ending waves, turning vast sections of the battlefield into infernos. Soldiers who had fought fearlessly against Balrogs fled before this new terror. The lesser dragons hunted them like wolves culling sheep, while Ancalagon's flames melted entire formations into glass. The Eagles of Manwë, led by mighty Thorondor, rose to meet this threat. These were no ordinary birds, but ancient beings of pride and power. Their wings spread wide enough to challenge dragons, their talons sharp enough to pierce scales. The sky itself became a battlefield as the mightiest flyers of Middle-earth clashed in aerial combat. But even the great eagles found themselves outmatched by Ancalagon's sheer size and power. His wings created gale-force winds that scattered the eagles. His flames forced them to maintain their distance, unable to close for attack. Those few eagles brave enough to attempt close combat either disappeared in bursts of fire or were crushed by his massive tail. Ancalagon's victory seemed absolute. The Black Dragon ruled the skies unchallenged, his massive form soaring over the battlefield like a living storm of destruction. Armies that had marched with divine blessing now huddled behind whatever cover remained, watching helplessly as their mightiest warriors fell before his onslaught. The very air burned with his dominance. Every counterattack had failed, every strategy proved useless, and every hope of victory turned to ash in his flames. As the battle seemed lost, hope appeared from the western horizon. Eärendil the mariner arrived in Vingilot, his enchanted ship that sailed through sky instead of sea. Upon his brow shone a Silmaril, one of the three great jewels that had sparked the wars of the First Age. Its holy light cut through the darkness Ancalagon had brought, creating a beacon of hope for the forces below. Ancalagon recognized this new threat and turned his full attention to Eärendil. The dragon's attack was relentless, his flames hot enough to vaporize mountains, his wings creating storms with each beat. Vingilot danced through the maelstrom, using clouds for cover and wind currents for speed. The duel evolved into a deadly game of cat and mouse across the heavens. Ancalagon's raw power met Eärendil's skill and agility. The dragon's flames lit up the sky like a second sun, while Vingilot's wake cut silver paths through the clouds. Below, armies seeking cover raised their heads to watch the titanic battle above, hardened warriors flinching at every earth-shaking roar, their bodies pressed against whatever shelter remained as two titans decided their fate. The combat raged through the day and into a dark night of doubt, where friend and foe became indistinguishable in the chaos above. Neither Eärendil nor Ancalagon could gain decisive advantage as they clashed in the starless void. Ancalagon's attacks grew more ferocious in the darkness, his flames briefly illuminating the battlefield below like false dawns. Yet each burst of fire revealed nothing but empty air where Eärendil had been moments before. His frustration mounted with each failed strike, each evasion by this seemingly insignificant foe. As the night wore on and doubt gnawed at all who watched from below, Ancalagon gathered his remaining strength for one final devastating assault. The dragon's fury reached its peak just as the first hint of true dawn began to lighten the sky. In that crucial moment between night and day, before the sun could spill its light across the world, Eärendil rose to meet the great dragon's charge. Thousands below, armies of both light and darkness alike, watched transfixed as flame and holy light pierced the fading night, until at last Eärendil prevailed, and Ancalagon the Black was slain. But Eärendil came, shining with white flame, and about Vingilot were gathered all the great birds of heaven, and Thorondor was their captain, and there was battle in the air all the day and through a dark night of doubt. Before the rising of the sun, Eärendil slew Ancalagon the Black, the mightiest of the dragon host, and cast him from the sky. The sound of Ancalagon's fall rolled across the battlefield like thunder, sending both armies to their knees. His roar of pain echoed across Middle-earth as he plummeted from the sky. His massive body, larger than any mountain, crashed into the triple peaks of Thangorodrim. The mountains that had stood since the world's beginning shattered like glass. Their ruins buried the gates of Angband itself. The remaining dragons, witnessing their leader's fall, lost all cohesion. Some fled north, never to be seen again. Others fell to the reinvigorated eagles, who showed no mercy in their pursuit. The armies of the west, inspired by Ancalagon's defeat, pressed their advantage. Morgoth's forces, their ultimate weapon destroyed, crumbled before this final assault. In the ages that followed, as dragons became increasingly rare, the story of Ancalagon grew into legend, and legend into myth. Yet its influence remained very real in the watchtowers that dotted the landscape, each built with guards trained to scan the skies. Every beings in Middle-earth learned to watch the skies with wary eyes. The greatest dragon had fallen, but the shadow of its wings would forever darken the memories of Middle-earth.